today I'm going to talk about, I haven't thought about alterity in a while. We'll get into a little bit about what I'm doing, but I wrote a book, I think it's been 10 years now, it's called Mapping the Global Architecture of Alterity. And so I was going to take this kind of keynote as an opportunity to revisit it, because I have a tendency when I write to, as soon as I'm done, forget everything I thought. And so I just thought it'd be really good to get back into alterity and to kind of look at where I was 10 years ago and try to match it up to what I'm working on a lot right now. So, and then also maybe dig a little bit deeper into alterity, because I'll tell you why. Like, the notion of alterity came very late in that book. Basically, this lecture will have 5 parts. Introduction, which will be looking at the book, Mapping the Global Architecture of Alterity. Part 1 will be the importance of alterity and understanding global societal challenges. So a lot of what I do involves globalization and practices and just how globalization is transforming what we do in general. Part 2 is the kind of crutch of the argument, the ultimate alterity of nature. And I'll get into what that means. Part 3, we'll look at a concept called convergence research, which is pretty big within the sciences right now, but it's along lines of complexity, nature, and then the conclusion will be a quick kind of speculation on convergent futures. So introduction, revisiting the mapping the global architecture of alterity. So basically, I'm going to show you a lot of text. I'm not going to read it all, but I generally like to give people the context and kind of not a little bit of the context of where I'm pulling the quote from. So this is a quote from the jacket, actually. Due to globalization, cultural spaces are now developing with no tangible connection to geographical place. The territorial logic traditionally used to underpin architecture and envision our built environment is being radically altered, forcing the adoption of a new method of conceptualization, space geography, which constitutes architectural practice. Globalization contained in this text, the issues and possible interactions with globalization contained in this text exemplify ways that architecture is transforming into a more flexible and fluid interdisciplinary version of its traditional self in order to rise the challenges of the new international terrain. Now, some of that's hopeful, because part of what I have issues with my discipline is we keep trying to do what we've always done and solve things with technology, not really change, not really transform our value system. And I think everybody's doing that. It's not just architecture. But that's a lot of what I was working on, like, how do we really think about doing architecture differently? And so when I started this book, I was like writing different essays, and they were on like the role of philosophy, and they were on technology and architecture and all these things. And so I had all these kind of trajectories going every which way. So when I started the book, it was this framing. And so there's basically 3 frames to the book. And as a way of taking all those, it's a bit like globalization, all those cross currents, and starting to frame them into areas where they overlap. They're not exactly on, they might be parallel, they might overlap. And it's very much the way that I envision globalization. So the first one focused on several key issues prevalent today as the profession continues to globalize. The identity, representation of the architect, the conceptual process of forming architecture's agendas and practices, and the environmental re-engagement of design. This section focuses on the processes involved in envisioning a contemporary design agenda and lays bare the fact that the most pressing issues in the relationship between globalization and architecture are not the actual buildings per se, but how architectural practice must adapt to global challenges. So one thing I like to really think about is, and I tell my students this, is that you're given a skill set. And don't be a kind of hammer looking for a nail. It isn't necessarily a building. And not every situation now is a building the right answer. So how do you start to think about a larger agenda of architecture? And the term I usually call that is architecture writ large. So how do you enlarge the scope of architecture? Now, and don't get me wrong, I love buildings. Like, I love that. I love the insertion. But I think, and this is, everybody is going through this, the disciplines are changing and need to change. The way we do research is changing. And so, in a way, I tell my students, you're much more marketable than what you think. You don't necessarily have to go work for a big firm. You don't necessarily have to do architecture, period. Oops, sorry. This thing's going to ask me the whole time, so I apologize. So that first one is really short, was representation and processes. The second I call material culture, and this is understanding architecture as a natural reflection of what is current socially, politically, and symbolically through four elements, through four architectural effects heavily influenced by trends instigated through globalization. That is public space, virtual space, modern vernacular architecture, and retail constructs. So it's basically started to really look at material languages and material culture and how globalization was affecting that. Third one was about design education. It said architectural and design education should surpass the rudimentary goal of merely training architects to be technically savvy, and aesthetically sophisticated, challenging students to continually ask how the issue studied affects the entirety of the situation. So getting outside of the plot line to plot line mentality, and even outside of necessarily an urban context. What are the larger implications within a regional context or even a global context? And then we should focus on a pedagogy, focus on finding, analyzing, and speculating upon the creation of spaces and constructs that educate occupants on how to inhabit these environments in ways that change preconceived outlooks and actions where people or ecological systems are exploited in injurious ways. So, how do we start to think about the larger picture, basically? And then how do we start to explore the systems, analyze them, that create architecture and what their overlaps are? So I was getting this book, it was almost written, and I came across this notion of alterity, and this is the actual definition. And so once I laid the frames down, then it started to be as a kind of introduction conclusion of like how everything that the frames were talking about was really speaking about alterity. So alterity, defined by the state of being other or different, diversity, otherness. Alterity is difference and otherness must be unpacked to begin understanding alterity and the cluster of meanings associated with otherness. Difference and otherness emphasize for the conditions or quality of separateness, dissimilarity, distinction, especially from an expected norm. And so this is really it's like one of those things where you're doing all this and then you read this one quote and you're like, that's exactly what I'm trying to do, right? So it says with an expectation for norms, sameness, and mimesis, seemingly opposes alterity or otherness through imitation or copy, yet such an opposition is not necessarily the case. And so that was really in the conclusion. That's kind of how I concluded it. But what was interesting to me is where I came in and thinking along the lines of this top, spatial rigidity, homogeneity, sameness, technological prowess, sustenance, economic improvement, prosperity, all the things that we think of our globalization is, and it is, right? There was this other kind of situation, this other, it was like the balance of the two that kept popping up, and I would describe it as situatedness, flux, difference, uniqueness, transience, openness, identity, engagement, technology versus the environment. These are all things. So where I was really focused on this whole thing of this technological wave that's integrating everything, some other things started to pop up, right? Which if you look at alterity makes sense. And that's why I started to really focus on it. But since then, it's chapter 3, which was towards a globally equitable relationship between nature and humanity, to me has become the most important, right? And it was really about our interaction with nature and our interaction with the environment. And so it just came up, the topic now is that we're going to really talk about today is alterity in nature. And that comes really from that third chapter. And in the third chapter, there was a term that a bunch of landscape architects I knew were bouncing around called radical gardening. And it was about this notion of cultivation and an interaction with nature that was more authentic. And they all claim that term, and none of them. I was like, somebody needs to coin it and put it on because everybody's claiming it. So we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into alterity and why it's important in understanding these. So we're going to hear, there's a lot of definitions, and we're going to go through a couple of them. So alterity refers to both the quality of strangeness in the other and the fact that the other is essentially strange. In other words, one cannot rely upon their prior knowledge or their prior experiences to prepare themselves to meet the other. So that's what I think is really appropriate in what I'm trying to do, that you can't go through and look at all of these forces with any kind of preconception, because as soon as you figure it out, they've changed. All right, alterity is then a double process of placement and perception. Michael Jenson envisioned alterity relationally when describing it as every inch a relationship, not a thing in itself. Alterity constitutes the grounds under which separation is possible. The subject exists because the other is irreconcilable with it. So this article, the concept of alterity in an era of Trump, is basically a study about how the way that a lot of philosophers use this term, they almost created a lot of the racism that we have today. It was a very interesting article. It surprised me where he ended up. But anyway, it had lots of really good analysis about what alterity was. Seen in this light, the intersubjectivity between the self and the other need not be an appropriation of the latter by the former. The dynamic interaction is one in which the other, through its absolute alterity, resists the categorizations forced upon it by the worldview of the self, as it seeks to know and understand. Through the strangeness of the other, its alterity, the other becomes irreducible to the understandings previously held by the self, and hence the self's assumptions are called into question and forced to deal with the other on its own terms. So again, that was a very long and academic way of saying what was earlier, that you cannot rely on your preconceptions, that there's this dynamic quality and it is constantly changing and transforming. Therefore, every encounter is a different encounter. And sometimes that slippery nature is really hard to grasp. All right. And this one, I'll show you a diagram because I think she had a really interesting take on it. This author says, the primitive other imitates, the moderns emulate, and they do it better than the model. One can thus portray identity, alterity dimensions as a circle, the larger part of which the moderns have reserved for themselves. The primitive others are supposed to remain at the extremes. They repeat themselves, and they are unlike anybody else. And the moderns are free to engage in the identity-alterity interplay in many diverse fashions. So if you see at the top, the primitives, or we'll say tradition, I guess, is in a very narrow field in the way the modernists kind of conceive. It's not modern architecture, let's say the modern project, and that there's this like fluctuation between these poles, and they take up almost 9/10 of the circle. The primitives, by that, is trying to always emulate the model. All right, crucially, modernist practices are characterized by human practitioners' aspirations to control nature and marginalize social groups. This control, however, is rarely achieved in practice. It is a fallacy based on grandiose belief in some human's ability to mold and master the world. And we're stuck in that right now in the States. Often using techno-scientific knowledges and artifacts implicated in the enactment of social power. This fallacy of control is a core ethos of modern practices. So that notion that we don't really attempt to understand things, we attempt to manipulate them and overpower them, is kind of really important. All right, so I think we've gone through enough definitions of alterity, but the reason that I gave you so many is I want to show that it's like a lot of this, like a lot of stuff in philosophy, it's like moments you catch it and in other moments you lose it. It's just, there's only way I can say it. And so, sometimes you can explain it in 3 words and other times it's just way too complex. So, but that kind of fluctuation is important. All right, so when I say, let me back up, the ultimate alterity of nature, so why is alterity important in relationship to nature? And you guys have probably seen this. This is a diagram on the Great Acceleration. You guys have heard that term, right? The Great, from 1950 to 2010. Everything basically, consumption and urban population are going up, as well as you can see on the right, they're taxing all the Earth systems, right? So within this 50-year period, 60-year period relatively, there's been population explosion, development explosion, and the counter to that is all our marine fish capture, all the resources are being tapped at a unsustainable rate. And there's this diagram is there are these kind of 4 boundaries, or there are 9 boundaries, but there are 4 that we've already crossed. And one is biosphere integrity. The other one's aerosol loading, ozone, novel entities. These are all things where we've kind of crossed over. If we cross over all 9, then I guess we're done, is the concept. All right, so to me, all of that the modern project and a lot of what those diagrams are showing they're really, because we have this, we'll say, skewed relationship to nature. And so that's why I'm titling as the ultimate alterity of nature. So everything that we deal with, pretty much, in my mind, goes through this relationship of humans and nature, because it is our environment. And so, but we have all kinds of issues, because what makes us strong as a species is our imagination, is our ability to manipulate and kind of force things onto other things. And I think we've done that with nature. So we're never going to get, in my opinion, we're never going to get past these diagrams till we start to really look at this relationship. So you almost have to go back to fundamental values. It says, so the more one knows, so this is William Cronin, and he's talking about wilderness, but he's also talking about nature. So you can take wilderness and you can just interchange it with nature. So the more one knows of its peculiar history, the more one realizes that wilderness is not quite what it seems. Far from being the one place on earth that stands apart from humanity, it is quite profoundly a human creation. Indeed, the creation of very particular human cultures at very particular moments in human history. So it's a product of that civilization. So when we say nature, it actually has really not a lot to do with what is out there. It's what's in here, right? Like what we lay on it as a construct. It's a product of that civilization and could hardly be contaminated by the very stuff of which it is made. Wilderness hides its unnaturalness behind a mask that is all the more beguiling because it is so natural. As we gaze into the mirror it holds up for us, we too easily imagine that we what we behold is nature, when in fact we see a reflection of our own unexamined longings and desires. For this reason, we mistake ourselves when we suppose that wilderness can be the solution to our culture's problematic relationships with the non-human world. For wilderness itself is itself no small part of the problem. So I don't know if it's happened here, but in the States, like I live in Colorado, and everybody moves to Colorado to be close to nature, right? And so I remember taking a friend, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago up to the mountains, and we sat in this huge traffic jam, worse than any traffic jam I've ever sat in a city. And it's just like everybody getting back to nature. And there's now huge industries. I don't know if you guys are up on campers and stuff, but it's pretty amazing what people buy now to get back to nature, and you go in this little urban lot. But anyway, what Cronin's really talking about, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but what he's talking about, the good and bad of that imagination, of that imaging of nature. So like one outcome is our whole park system, our national park system in the States is created on that whole ideal, on the rugged individual and this romantic quality of nature. But all the Indians were basically driven off, and they were truly the ones that were engaging in nature, and their cultures were kind of destroyed, basically from the modernist project. But he goes into, it's a really fascinating read. He goes into how all these implications about these constructs, these mental constructs that we place onto what is out there. Seen in this way, wilderness presents itself as the best antidote to our human selves, a refuge we must somehow recover if we hope to save the planet. As Henry David Thoreau once famously declared, in wilderness is the preservation of the world. But is it? The more one knows its peculiar history, the more one realizes that wilderness is not quite what it seems. So it's as much of a hindrance to us actually engaging in revaluing that we need to of non-human species, because we put this like imaginary preciousness on it, I guess. And his argument is the task, he says that we need to make a home in nature, right? And that we need to get over that notion of nature and wilderness, and somehow there's some place on earth that's untouched, because there's not really. Says the task of making a home in nature is what Wendell Berry has called the forever unfinished life work of our species. The only thing we have to preserve nature with, he writes, is culture. The only thing we have to preserve wildness with is domesticity. But if we acknowledge the autonomy and otherness of the things and creatures around us, an autonomy our culture has taught us to label with the word wild, then we will at least think carefully about the uses to which we put them, and even if we should use them at all. So he's asking you to truly engage in what we're doing, to realize, humans aren't all bad. We're actually part of an ecosystem. And when I was reading a lot of like deep ecology and all these other, and there's a lot of views, and some of them are just not very practical and actually a little bit frightening. But so in ecology, what I really like about reading it and the ecological philosophy is all the different arguments that are going on. So like the Anthropocene, which is so popular now in architecture, is really a contested topic. And the geologists don't really know when it started. They don't know whether it's helpful or if it's just another banner that is actually diverting us from what we're saying. But it sounds cool, right? I mean, so wilderness can stop being just out there and start being also in here, and if we can truly connect to it. If it can start being as humane as it is natural, then perhaps we can get on with the unending task of struggling to live rightly in the world, not just in the garden, not just in the wilderness, but in that home that encompasses them both. So this is that, I really see this quote as like, how do we truly engage nature? Now, until we truly engage nature, we're going to be slapping solar panels on buildings and calling it a day for sustainability. And I'm very kind of anti-sustainability, not because I think it's flawed concept. You can't sustain anything, but we also don't go about it right. It's demanding that we revalue things, and we're not. We're trying to solve it with technology. We're trying to solve it within the modernist project. All right, so in a way, we're inside and outside of nature. We're that alterity. Right? And this is what I like about this quote is what Joel Kovler says, we should learn to live with contradiction, like how that is as a contradiction, that it is dialectically between contrary states of being. I mean, live with and not simply intellectually understand. For the contradiction in question is existential. Two kinds of things obtain for us at the same time. In defiance of ordinary logic, we are at one time part of nature, fully participating in natural processes, and at the same time we are radically different from nature, ontologically destined by a dialectic between attachment and separation to define ourselves in a significant field which by its very nature negates nature. All right, so I just think the marriage of radical ecology, so Joe Koval's a radical socialist, and I think he just died, but he turned his lens to ecology, and it was produced some pretty interesting work. Another author, Frederick Turner, is the same. He's a bit like, he writes about democracy and classical spirit. Said we must embrace as an activist, restorationist environmentalism that goes with, not against, the natural inclination of humanity toward greater experience, self-awareness, mutual feedback, and technical power. Our job is not to leave nature alone or to coexist peacefully with it. We are its future, its promise, and its purpose. Its future landscapes are partly up to us. So again, it's that continuous engagement with nature, not in the form necessarily of how we conceive landscapes, but as we conceive systems, and as multiple systems are starting to lay across, one of them being natural, one of them being technological, one of them being cultural. So you've heard me mention a couple of times this notion of the modernist project. And this quote is really about a really good article about how we move from the modernist project to, and what it's attempting to do, which is probably that first line I gave you from Globalization, really how I came into the book. Like, it's about control, it's about suppressing uncertainties, contingencies. It's trying to commandeer appropriate agency from like a larger project, standardized governance, and it's always based on a narrowly defined efficiency, i.e. a lot of buildings are always about their economics, right? Harm, marginalized humans, other living beings, extend modern universalism, and if you don't fall into that, you disqualify the other than modern practices. So that's a lot of what globalization is trying to do. It's this integration, this systemic, we'll say, wave that's kind of going across the world. And if we're going to move away from that, we're going to move into what's called caring practices. And so caring practices admit uncertainties and they cultivate humility. They're not trying to overpower nature. They're trying to understand it, or whatever subject that it's studying. It acknowledges situatedness and engages with others from below. It's not a top-down. It's almost like a bottom-up kind of mentality. And then it accounts for agency and the hybrid collectives of agency. And admits their precariousness, and it takes responsibilities for the output. And it enacts a transformative engagement with diverse other practices. So it becomes that counter, it becomes that offset to the modernist project. All right, so part 3, complexity, convergence, and nature. So how many of you have heard about convergence research as a topic? So convergence research so I work in the research office. I work with people, every discipline across the campus. Work with a lot of engineers, scientists, people in humanities. And there's a new model that the NSF in 2017 put out this Dear Colleague letter. And it started to talk about this notion of the necessity for convergence research. And quickly, convergence research can be characterized as a deep integration of knowledge, techniques, and expertise from multiple fields to form new and expanded frameworks for addressing scientific and societal challenges and opportunities. It's a deep integration across disciplines, creates new frameworks, paradigms, or disciplines can form from sustained interactions across multiple communities. Convergence research is generally inspired by the need to address a specific challenge or opportunity, whether it arises from deep scientific questions or pressing societal needs. And then the convergence paradigm augments a more traditional transdisciplinary approach to research by framing challenging research questions at inception and fostering the collaborations needed for successful inquiry. So one thing that's different about convergence research is you outline the problem very specifically. It's just the problem is large. Or as I've heard in the States, wicked is the term. Let me make sure. So convergence research is driven by specific and compelling problems and requires deep integrations across disciplines. The potential of convergence research is widely recognized, but questions remain about how to design, facilitate, and assess such research. Many pressing societal problems such as pandemics, antibiotic resistance, global climate change, and sustainable development span established academic disciplines. For the problems like these, improving understanding of underlying trade-offs and providing effective decision support requires integrating expertise and insights across disciplines and stakeholders. So at my institution right now, we're doing something called the Grand Challenges, and we're actually giving out a fair amount of money, anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000 for people to, I like to say, to pay for the extra of convergence research, which is all that time that you need to basically develop your relationships. To, in a way, very pragmatically, you're in an alterity situation where you're trying to understand what another discipline does, someone else in another discipline. So there's all this like build up to and team dynamics just to get to the point where you can start to do your research. The idea is that now when we talk about things like climate change, there's no way that one discipline is going to solve climate change. And that not enough people, it's getting like the generations behind us are getting better at it, but most of us were trained very much in a discipline that sees the world in a very distinct way. And so now the push is like, how do you, and everybody, it's really funny, everybody's like, I do interdisciplinary stuff, and I'm like, no, you don't. Because if you did, you wouldn't talk about it in such a happy fashion, because it's very difficult, right? But the potential is great, and that we're actually getting ourselves in a situation where we have no choice but to start to do this. So to me, it's like very much bringing this notion of alterity down into a fairly pragmatic usage, I guess. So its benefits are application of ideas to new context, comparison of multiple viewpoints, specific context within a specific context, negotiating among conflicts, reconciliation or synthesis of competing viewpoints, to produce an improved understanding. And each step within this continuum builds upon the previous step, and the initial step of synthesis is the most difficult to achieve. So starting that team dynamic is the most difficult part. So we do things like, we have the grand challenges, which they have to put in a proposal from across. I think we have teams of 50 people sometimes. Talk about alterity, right? Getting an engineer and artists in the room. They really think that they navigate the world pretty similarly, and they don't. But what I find a lot, within my college, we have planning, landscape architecture, and architecture, and say, well, we're interdisciplinary. And I'm like, that's not really interdisciplinary. I mean, you need to go talk to the biologist, or you need to talk, that's the level of interdisciplinarity that we need. All right, the drawbacks are time and resources, because it's extra. I always have this thing on the presentation for the Grand Challenges groups before they're gonna submit, and it's just like we pay for extra, and that's what it's for, so that they can go get grants. So everybody wants to fund it, right? NSF wants to fund it. All the big American agencies want to fund it, but nobody knows how to do it yet. And then it's like counter to tenure. Like I tell people, like, be really careful about this, because your tenure package is going to be all about your discipline, but you have to somehow weave in why this was important. I was one of the first generations to actually get tenured on interdisciplinarity in my institution. It was really hard. It was really a firefight, right? It wasn't at the top level, but it was really a firefight in my college. So differing levels of personal commitment. You get people on a team, some are committed, some are not. Difficulties with communication. Everybody speaks different languages, right? This is challenges with publication. It's getting better. There's usually a lack of encouragement from like department chairs, administrators, and a trade-off between interdisciplinary breadth and the depth. Like when do you leave your discipline so much that you're really not, say, an expert in anymore? So I always see like convergence as bridging. You're bringing your expertise. You're not making mush. You're bringing your expertise into the room, and you're bridging to other disciplines. In Boulder, we had a program called environmental design, and I hated it, right? Because they're always like, "Wow, we're just gonna," and all the architects are like, "No, like I want to be an expert. Like I have to take this test and all this," and I found myself arguing against it, and them accusing me of being, deeply disciplinarian. It was just ended up being a weird situation, but it's because interdisciplinary is about bridging. It's not about mush. You clearly know what you bring to the table, right? And expertise is valuable. And I think convergence is trying to find new ways to cultivate that value. All right, so I mentioned grand challenges. So grand challenges are ambitious but achievable goals that harness science, technology, and innovation to solve important national or global problems and inherently contain the potential to capture the public's imagination. So that's really key. Like what you're trying to solve is very describable. It's very easy to describe in an elevator pitch. The implications of that are huge and never-ending and probably can't be solved. So a really good example is climate change. No. Okay, so it's things like global hunger, poverty, homelessness, sustainability, resilience, climate change. These are things that grand challenges attempt to, and what are these things? These are on a global scale for the most part. Every one of these, to a certain degree in every country, is a problem or an issue. Oops, sorry. All right, and then you're trying to with convergence research or grand challenges, you're trying to create Venn diagrams like that up on the upper left, where all these different, like these overlaps are starting to help. This is one for like geology, environmental scientists, and you look, there's agriculture and forestry, there's physics, and there's in the center, there's ocean and climate because it's earth science. So there's these overlapping Venn diagrams that you're trying to create. So each one of those, where the overlap is another relationship, is another state of alterity. Okay, I've given you this before, but I'm gonna bring it back up because I think it's important. Alterity refers to the quality of strangeness in the other and the fact that the other is essentially strange. In other words, one cannot rely upon their prior knowledge or their prior experiences to prepare themselves to meet the other. So when you come into a convergence situation to do convergence research, you have your expertise, but you can't preconceive what the relationship is going to be. People do it all the time, and then as soon as I hear it, it's like, that one's not going to work. So even in university, we see it as a bet, right? Maybe half of I think I have 7 interdisciplinary teams that are maybe 500 faculty now, 400 to 500 faculty, and I figure half of those will be successful. And success, as far as we're concerned, is getting that to the next level and getting those larger grants, and hopefully those networks start to be multi-institutional, not just across one institution. And well, I've even said if we have 30%, we're good, right? And so really when you're talking about research, convergence research, you have to allow people to fail because they're doing something new. That's why it's really difficult to have preconceptions about it. It's not going to work. Oh, there we go. All right, so then we're almost in the conclusion. Okay, so to solve or study even more complex problems that involve various issues at the same time, such as poverty, discrimination, sustainability, exploitation, oppression, globalization, capitalist ideology, and the free market, it is necessary that we reach a deeper level of discipline interaction, a level that goes beyond the lens of multidisciplinary and the interactions of interdisciplinary. It is this cooperation of disciplinary frameworks we refer to as transdisciplinary. Actually, convergence research claims to go beyond transdisciplinary. Because transdisciplinary, it's kind of like people we want to work together. But see, you never do that with convergence research. You have a problem and you find the expertise you need. So it becomes subjective, constructing its own method depending on the problem and the various actors involved in it. It's never the same, right? When different people are in the room, it's never the same. All right. I don't know why this doesn't. It was working. Oh, there it goes. All right. So we need to, and I think that there's a couple of things we need to start really coming to terms with. Uncertainty is one of them, right? For architects, we're all experts. Your client doesn't want to hear that you're uncertain, right? But in reality, you are uncertain, especially if you're pushing the envelope. But I think what this quote is about getting out of the notion of prediction and going into something called foresight. So prediction presents a singular path to the future. It lays it out. We're going to do this, this, and this. Foresight surveys the temporal topography and scouts out obstacles, dangers, and opportunities. While it is impossible to predict the future in conditions of deep uncertainty, it is possible to foresee many futures. And to me, that's the crux of it, that you have to be able to lay out a lot of different pathways in case something goes wrong. President Eisenhower, do you guys know who Eisenhower is? Yeah? The guy who organized D-Day and all that. I was just thinking when I read that, I was like, we all in the States know who Eisenhower is, but you guys might not. Observe that the plans are worthless, but planning is everything, right? So very detailed plans are pretty much worthless. They're going to be wrong. There is a very great distinction because when you're planning for an emergency, you must start with this one thing. The very definition of emergency is that it is unexpected. Therefore, it is not going to happen the way you're planning. And if you look at, the climate crisis, that is an emergency. Homelessness is an emergency, right? We don't know how to solve it. I'm sorry, it's not happy with me. All right. But practically speaking, going with our long suit means taking actions in the near term that preserve the most choices for the long term. Robust climate policy plans fall short and options long by means of diverse distributed and transparent participation, safe-to-fail experimentation, and exploratory foresight. It promotes a clear-eyed confrontation with uncertainty in the realms of climate, technology, and politics, allowing us to engage in pliant planning without being wedded to rigid plans. And so that's really key. Like, how do we start to become flexible? How do we, as a discipline, conceive of new ways of operating? There will always be a well-known situation to every, there will always be a well-known solution to every human problem, neat, plausible, and wrong. There are no clear and simple solutions to climate change. And the reason I'm using climate change is because these are the people that are talking about how we need to change the way we research, the way we do things the most. The path will not be straight or steady. We will often need to reorient ourselves and blaze new trails. Our best option is a widely participative and experimental approach that exploits our capacities for foresight. Such robust climate policy will make us more adaptive and innovative and allow us to better navigate the slopes, valleys, flat meadows, rock steps, and precipices ahead. So I like that quote because I think that applies to pretty much every discipline, right? And we don't like to see it like that. We like to see things in a linear fashion. Like, if I do this, that's going to happen. If I do that, that's going to happen. But really, nothing's working like that, if it ever has. And then professions tend to impose, as far as they can, a fixed cohesion on situations. Disciplines tend to acknowledge and embrace the inherent impossibility of fixed cohesion and offer a loose label under which a continual search for a responsive cohesion can thrive. I really like that definition of a profession because it really, so a profession has to market itself. It has, people have to know what it does, right? So but then there's always this problem of certain expectations being laid on it. And that, how do you start to offer a loose cohesion underneath that? And then this is from an ethicist called Warwick Fox. He's an Australian. And I used this quote in a paper 10 years ago, or longer now, maybe it was 12 years ago, that was really about this notion of where we needed to go with sustainability. It was really arguing against sustainability because it was fixed, because it was actually a technological fix, the way we were looking at it. And so what Warwick Fox is talking about is this notion of responsiveness and flexible cohesion, which is very much along what the convergence research model is. So the term cohere literally means cling, hold, stick, or adhere together. From the Latin cohere, from together, and then hetera, to cling, adhere. So that's why convergence research always comes to mind, because that's what you're doing. Like my team still have their work, right? They're still getting all kinds of grants from other people, but they're setting up, they'll have like 8 or 9 thrusts, and it'll be under one large heading, and then people are going for grants and that, and it's feeding back up into the larger question at the top of it. Because once you start to set up something like that, and sometimes certain thrusts will be going and then they'll die off and those people will dissipate. So the most important, I'm really hard on our PIs, or principal investigators, because they're the managers of the whole thing. So as long as they see it's going okay, if they're adding people or letting people go, that's fine. But if they can't tell me what each thrust is doing, then I start to really question it. And it's this notion because the most successful ones expand, and then other times they'll contract, depending on a lot of things, like just what we were talking about, like people just don't deliver, right? And they'll let that thrust go. There may be a new federal funding call that it overlaps with what they're doing, and they can feed it back up to the larger question, and they'll go for that grant, and they'll put together a team to do that. So responsive to and answers to the challenges thrown up by the other side. The upshot of the process is that cohesion between the two sides is ultimately brought about, assuming this goal is reached through a process of mutual accommodation, adjustment, adaptation, and reconciliation between theory and evaluation. And then questioning practice, which is what we all need to do, clearly implies that future educational paths should adapt to support a generation of designers that not only knows what design is and how science works, but that it is also aware of how transdisciplinary research can lead to beneficial outcomes for the multiplicity of target audiences considered during the research process. And that goes very much back to that quote I gave you in frame 3 about education, about this notion of analysis and questioning. That what we bring to the table as designers is visualization. We can visualize for different audiences what a lot of disciplines can't. It's too esoteric. That's it. Yay, made it all the way through.